begins not with a date, but with a feeling. A quiet dread that settles over a city like the damp river fog that clings to the cobblestones before dawn. In the city of Rome, under the reign of its seventh king Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, a man known to history, and to the whispers in the darkened alleyways, simply as Tarquin the Proud, to be alive was to be aware of the precariousness of your own existence. It was a city holding its breath. You could feel it in the marketplace, where the usual boisterous haggling was muted, where eyes darted nervously, never lingering too long on the royal guard. You could hear it in the silence of your neighbors, the family whose laughter once spilled into the street now behind shuttered windows, their eldest son having spoken too freely in a wine shop a week prior. He was simply gone. Power was not an abstract concept. It was the arrogant stride of the king's sons, Sextus and his brothers, as they moved through the city like it was their personal property, their gaze a casual dismissal of every man and an appraisal of every woman. It was the sudden, unexplainable prosperity of those who bowed lowest, and the quiet disappearance of those who stood too straight. This was not yet the Rome of legend, the marble heart of the world. This was a city of wood and brick, and it was ruled by a deep and abiding fear, the fear of a single man who answered to no one. It was a fear that would become a ghost, a specter that would haunt the civilization born from its shadow for 1,000 years. This story, the long story of Rome, is not merely a sequence of events, a catalogue of battles and emperors. It is the story of a deep and enduring conflict born from this very fear. The Romans, in a violent act of rebellion, would build a world on one foundational principle: Rex non erat. A king there shall not be. Never again shall one man hold absolute power over the lives of its citizens. They would engineer a system, a republic, designed with the express purpose of thwarting the ambition of the individual. Yet, for the next 2 millennia, their entire history, from the fields of Italy to the sands of Syria, would be defined by the titanic struggle between this ideal and the relentless ambition of the great men it produced. This is the story of Rome's long, bloody, and glorious war with itself. The city's birth was itself a dark omen, a story the Romans told themselves not with uncomplicated pride, but with a kind of grim recognition. It was a founding myth that contained the seed of their greatest fear. The twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, abandoned to the wild, suckled by a she-wolf, were the embodiment of primal survival. They were destined for greatness, divinely appointed to found a city that would rule the world. But when they stood upon their chosen hills, the Palatine and the Aventine, ready to build, their shared destiny fractured. The argument was over a name, over a boundary, over a flight of birds. But in truth, it was about something deeper. It was about who would lead, who would have the final say. When Remus, in a gesture of mocking defiance, leaped over the half-built wall of his brother's new city, Romulus struck him down. In the shadow of his brother's cooling body, Romulus declared, "So shall it be for all who dare to cross my walls." The city of Rome was born from fratricide. It was founded not in brotherhood, but in an act of ultimate singular ambition, one man killing his own blood for the sake of sole power. This act became the original sin, the genetic flaw in the city's character that it would spend the next 500 years trying to contain within the intricate cage of law and tradition. The era of the 7 kings that followed was a slow tightening of this grip. It was a lesson, taught over generations, in the dangers of placing the city's fate in one man's hands. The first kings, like Romulus himself and the wise Numa Pompilius, were perhaps necessary, strong leaders who established the city's laws, its religious rites, and its military traditions. They were the architects of the state. But with each succession, the nature of that power shifted. What began as a position granted by the people and acclaimed by the Senate slowly began to feel like an inheritance. The power became hereditary, personal, and then, inevitably, tyrannical. The reigns of the later kings, particularly the final one, Tarquin the Proud, demonstrated the logical endpoint of this system. He had seized the throne through murder, ruled without the consent of the Senate, and used fear as his primary tool of governance. He built grand temples and public works, but he built them with forced labor. He expanded Rome's influence, but he did so for his own glory. The king had ceased to be the city's servant. The city had become the king's possession. The breaking point, when it came, was not a political calculation or a strategic coup. It was a moment of profound and personal violation that became a symbol for the violation of the state itself. The king's son, Sextus Tarquinius, consumed by lust and the arrogance of his station, traveled to the home of a nobleman, Collatinus. There, he was welcomed as a guest and, in the dead of night, he forced himself upon Collatinus's wife, Lucretia, a woman renowned throughout Rome for her virtue. Her violation was not just a crime against a person. It was a brutal demonstration of the unchecked power of the royal family. It was the ultimate expression of a system where the whims of one man and his sons were law. Lucretia, in her grief and shame, did not remain silent. She summoned her father, her husband, and their most trusted friend Lucius Junius Brutus, a man who had long feigned idiocy to survive in Tarquin's court. She told them what had happened, her voice steady with a terrible resolve. "I am innocent of the crime," she said, her eyes fixed on them, "but I will not be free from the punishment. Let no Roman woman hereafter live dishonored. Swear to me that the adulterer shall not go unpunished." After they had sworn their oaths, she drew a dagger she had concealed in her robes and plunged it into her own heart. That moment changed everything. The sight of her body, carried from her home and displayed in the public forum, transformed quiet resentment into incandescent rage. It was Brutus, the man who had played the fool, who pulled the bloody dagger from her chest and held it aloft. "By this blood," he roared, his voice ringing with a newfound clarity. "So pure before a prince's outrage, I swear, and I call you, O gods, to witness my oath, that I will pursue Lucius Tarquinius Superbus and his wicked wife and all their children, with fire and sword and all the violence in my power, and I will not suffer them or any other man to be king in Rome." The rebellion that followed was not a war. It was an exorcism. It was an act of collective trauma, a city-wide vow, sworn over Lucretia's body, to build something new, a system that would ensure no woman, no man, no family would ever again be at the mercy of one man's lust or another's ambition. Out of this fire, they began to build the machine. The creation of the Republic's institutions was a masterpiece of political engineering, with every component designed to prevent the reemergence of a king. Power, they reasoned, was the problem. The solution was to break it into pieces. They replaced the single, lifelong king with two consuls, chief magistrates elected for a single year. Two so that one could always check the other. For a single year so that no man could accumulate too much power over time. Each consul held a veto over the other's actions, a permanent break on unilateral decisions. They retained the Senate, an advisory council of the city's elder statesmen, the patricians, whose experience was meant to provide a steady hand, a source of collective wisdom to guide the yearly consuls. They created assemblies of the people, where citizens could vote on laws and elect their magistrates. Every office, every term limit, every veto was a carefully calibrated gear in this complex machine, a fail-safe designed for one purpose: to diffuse power and chain down the ambition of any single individual who might dream of becoming a new Romulus, a new Tarquin. This new machine, however, faced its first critical test not from a foreign enemy, but from within. The plebeians, the common people of Rome, quickly realized that this meticulously designed system protected them from a king, but it did not protect them from the patrician elite who controlled the Senate and the consulship. The laws were unwritten, interpreted and applied by patrician judges for their own benefit. Debt could lead to bondage. Justice was a privilege, not a right. The plebeians saw that the machine, as built, only protected the powerful. Their struggle, which came to be known as the conflict of the orders, was a centuries-long fight to gain access to the controls of this anti-tyranny device. In a series of strikes, they seceded from the city, refusing to serve in the army until their grievances were heard. One of their first great victories was the creation of the office of the tribune of the plebs. These were officials elected by the common people, who had the extraordinary power to veto any act of the Senate or the magistrates that harmed the plebeians. They were sacrosanct. To harm a tribune was a capital crime. "We need a shield," one of the early plebeian leaders, Sicinius, was said to have argued in the secret meetings on the Aventine Hill. "The consuls have their lictors and their axes. The senators have their wealth and their ancient names. What do we have? We are the arms and legs of Rome, but we have no voice. The tribunate will be our voice. It will be the word no that we can shout in the very heart of the forum, a word they cannot ignore." Later, they fought for and won the publication of the laws on 12 tables of bronze, displayed for all to see, ensuring that justice was no longer a secret known only to the elite. The conflict of the orders was a slow, arduous process of debugging the Republic, ensuring that its protections extended to every citizen, not just the privileged few. With its internal checks and balances gradually falling into place, the immense, restless ambition of Roman leaders was finally channeled outward. The machine was designed to prevent any one man from achieving ultimate glory within Rome, but it actively encouraged them to seek that glory for Rome on the field of battle. To be elected consul was the highest honor, and the surest path to political influence and historical renown was a successful military campaign. The perfect embodiment of this new ideal was a man named Cincinnatus. He was a former consul, a patrician who had fallen on hard times and was working his own small farm. An enemy army, the Equi, had trapped a Roman consular army in the hills. In this moment of crisis, the Senate took the extraordinary step of appointing a dictator, an emergency office that granted one man absolute power for a term of 6 months. The senators sent to Cincinnatus found him plowing his fields. They explained the situation and he accepted the call. He put on his toga, went to Rome, raised a new army, marched out, defeated the enemy, rescued the trapped legions, and held a triumph, all in 16 days. Then, with nearly 6 months of absolute power still his to command, he did the unthinkable. He resigned the dictatorship and went back to his plow. He became the ultimate Republican hero, the model against which all future Roman leaders would be measured. He was a man who answered the state's call, wielded immense power responsibly, and then, crucially, gave it up without a second thought. He served the state, then disappeared back into it. He demonstrated that it was possible to be great without becoming a king. This system, which rewarded ambition as long as it served the Republic, proved to be an engine of incredible power. Over the next 2 centuries, a succession of ambitious nobles, competing with each other for honor and prestige, led Roman armies across the Italian peninsula. Each victory brought them personal glory, but it also brought Rome new territory, new allies, and new wealth. The Samnite Wars, a brutal, multi-generational struggle for the control of central Italy, forged the Roman legions into the most formidable fighting force the world had ever seen. The war against the Greek king Pyrrhus in the south taught them how to adapt and persevere even after suffering devastating losses. Slowly, painstakingly, the Republic subdued or allied with every city and tribe from the Po Valley to the Straits of Sicily. The competing ambitions of its greatest men, which could have torn the city apart in civil war, were instead harnessed for the collective good. The Republic seemed to have solved the fundamental problem of human nature. It had created a system that could contain the uncontainable, that could turn the selfish drive for power into a force for communal greatness. The system, born of the fear of a single man, seemed to have perfected itself. It had successfully channeled the ambition of its leaders outward, against Rome's enemies, building an Italian empire in the process. The annual cycle of elections, the competition among the elite for glory, the shared power of the consuls. It all worked in a brutal but effective harmony. But the machine was built to manage the ambitions of Roman men. It had never been tested against an outside force so terrifying, so utterly brilliant and implacable, that the Romans would be forced to question the very foundations of their system. What would happen when an enemy appeared who could not be defeated by the standard rotation of generals? What would happen when the fear of destruction became greater than the fear of a king? A shadow was gathering south of the sea, in the rival city of Carthage. And with that shadow came a man whose name would become a specter to haunt Roman nightmares for generations. A man who would force the Republic to grant one of its sons a level of power that rivaled that of the very tyrants they had sworn to despise forever. The specter's name was Hannibal Barca. The Second Punic War was not like the other wars Rome had fought. It was an existential struggle. Hannibal did not fight on some distant frontier. He brought the war to the heart of Italy. His crossing of the Alps with his war elephants was a feat of military genius that struck terror into the Roman consciousness. At the river Trebia at Lake Trasimene, and then, most catastrophically, at the Battle of Cannae, he inflicted upon the Romans a series of defeats so total, so devastating, that they shook the foundations of the Republic. Cannae was not just a battle. It was a national trauma. An entire consular army, perhaps as many as 70,000 men, was annihilated in a single afternoon. The system of electing 2 new generals each year, a system designed to prevent any one man from becoming too powerful, was now failing spectacularly. One consul after another was sent out to face Hannibal, and one after another, they were outmaneuvered and destroyed. The Republic was losing. The fear that had once been reserved for a tyrant in their own city was now directed at a foreign general who seemed invincible. The carefully constructed machine was breaking under the strain. It needed something more. It needed a savior. From the ashes of these defeats emerged a young man named Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was everything the old guard of the Senate was trained to distrust. He was young, barely in his mid-20s when he was given his first command. He was brilliant, audacious, and utterly unconventional. His family had been devastated by the war. His father and uncle had been killed fighting Hannibal's brother in Spain. Yet he showed no fear, only a burning, almost messianic confidence in his own abilities. He operated outside the traditional career path, the cursus honorum, that every Roman noble was expected to follow. When no one else wanted the command in Spain, a theater of war that had become a graveyard for Roman generals, Scipio volunteered. The people, desperate for a hero, granted it to him, overriding the cautious objections of the Senate. He was the embodiment of the exceptional individual, the man of singular genius that the republican system was specifically designed to contain. But in this desperate hour, Rome had no other choice but to unleash him. Scipio's campaigns in Spain were a masterclass in generalship. He captured the main Carthaginian base at New Carthage through a daring and unexpected amphibious assault. He defeated Carthaginian armies in open battle, using tactics that were as innovative as Hannibal's own. But he won not just with strategy, he won with charisma. His soldiers, many of them the demoralized survivors of Cannae, came to adore him. He treated them with respect, learned their names, and led them from the front. The Spanish tribes, who had been allied with Carthage, were won over by his clemency and his almost royal bearing. They began to revere him, some even attempting to declare him a king, an offer he wisely and publicly refused. A cult of personality, the very thing the Republic feared most, began to form around this brilliant young general. Whispers of this devotion, this personal loyalty that transcended duty to the state, traveled back across the sea to a nervous and deeply suspicious Senate in Rome. His success only deepened the divide between him and the old guard. The voice of the Republic's founding fear was embodied by a man named Quintus Fabius Maximus, an aged senator who had earned the nickname the Cunctator, or the Delayer, for his strategy of avoiding direct battle with Hannibal. Fabius represented the cautious, traditional, and deeply conservative spirit of the Senate. He saw in Scipio not a savior, but a dangerous precedent. When Scipio returned from his victorious campaign in Spain and proposed his boldest plan yet, to ignore Hannibal in Italy and invade Carthage's homeland in Africa, Fabius argued vehemently against it. Are we to place the fate of Rome itself in the hands of one young man's ambition? Fabius might have argued on the floor of the Senate, his voice heavy with the wisdom of years. He has won victories, yes, but he has also cultivated a personal following that is unbecoming of a Roman magistrate. He operates as if the rules do not apply to him. To grant him an army to invade Africa is to give him power that no Roman has held since the kings. What happens if he fails? We are left defenseless. And what happens if he succeeds? He will return to us not as a citizen, but as a conqueror, his legions loyal to him and not to this body. We built this republic to be ruled by laws, not by men. We are forgetting the lessons learned in the blood of Lucretia. This was the system, the old, cautious machine, trying to reassert control over the brilliant, unpredictable individual it had been forced to empower. But the people, tired of Fabius's delays and captivated by Scipio's promise of victory, sided with the young general. The Senate reluctantly gave him the command. The triumph at the Battle of Zama was Scipio's masterpiece. On the plains of North Africa, he finally faced Hannibal in a decisive battle. He had studied his enemy for years, and he used Hannibal's own tactics against him, creating lanes in his formation to channel the charge of the Carthaginian war elephants and then using his superior cavalry to encircle and destroy Hannibal's army. The long nightmare was over. Hannibal was defeated, and Carthage sued for peace. Scipio returned to Rome not just as a victorious general, but as a living legend. The Senate bestowed upon him the name Africanus in honor of his conquest. He was, without question, the most powerful, most popular, and most beloved man the Republic had ever produced. And for that very reason, he was now the most dangerous. The war at home began almost immediately. His enemies in the Senate, led by men like Cato the Elder, a staunch traditionalist who saw Scipio's Hellenistic tastes and popular appeal as a corrupting foreign influence, moved to cut him down to size. They could not attack his military record, so they attacked his character and his finances. They launched a series of legal charges against him and his brother, accusing them of financial impropriety during the Eastern campaigns. The charges were flimsy, based on innuendo and jealousy, but their purpose was clear: to humble the man who had saved them, to remind him that even the great Scipio Africanus was subject to the laws and the will of the Senate. It was the Republic's immune system, which had been suppressed during the crisis of the war, now roaring back to life and attacking the very cell that had cured its disease. They sought to prove that no man, not even the conqueror of Hannibal, was above the system. Scipio, a man of immense pride, was disgusted and heartbroken. In a dramatic scene before the Senate, he was said to have torn up his own account books, refusing to dignify the accusations with a defense. He would not allow the state he had saved to put him on trial like a common criminal. But he also refused to take the other path available to him. With his immense popularity among the people and the unwavering loyalty of his veterans, he could have easily incited civil strife. He could have marched on the Forum and taken by force the power that was being denied him by a jealous aristocracy. He could have become Rome's first king. Instead, he made a choice. He withdrew from Rome, retiring to his country estate in a form of voluntary exile. He declared that, "Ungrateful country of mine, you shall not have my bones." He chose a quiet, bitter retirement over civil war, placing the health of the Republic, as he saw it, before his own personal honor. He was the perfect Cincinnatus, but on a tragic, grander scale. He had been granted absolute power, had saved the state, and had walked away. He was the last of his kind. A new generation of ambitious men was watching. They learned a different lesson from Scipio's story. They saw that the Republic would reward a man's service with suspicion and humiliation. They would not be so noble. When their time came, they would not leave the city. They would march upon it. The first crack in the foundation appeared a generation later, not with a general, but with two brothers from an elite family, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They saw the rot that had set into the Republic in the wake of its great conquests. The vast wealth flowing in from the provinces was being concentrated in the hands of the senatorial elite, who bought up vast tracts of land. The small farmers, the citizen soldiers who had formed the backbone of the legions that conquered Hannibal, were being dispossessed, forced off their land and into the teeming, unemployed masses of the city. The Gracchi brothers saw this as an existential threat to Rome. An army of small-holding citizens was loyal to the Republic. A landless mob was loyal only to whomever would feed them. Using the ancient office of tribune of the plebs, they attempted to pass land reform bills to redistribute public land back to the poor. Their opponents, the wealthy senators who controlled the vast estates, saw this not as reform, but as theft. They saw the Gracchi not as saviors, but as demagogues, stirring up the mob to seize their property and their power. The conflict escalated. Tiberius, seeking to protect himself, ran for an unprecedented second consecutive term as tribune. His opponents claimed this was an attempt to make himself a king. During a chaotic assembly, a mob of senators and their clients, their togas hitched up for action, grabbed makeshift clubs and the broken legs of benches and stormed the gathering. There, on the Capitoline Hill, in the sacred heart of the city, Tiberius Gracchus, a sacrosanct tribune of the plebs, was bludgeoned to death along with hundreds of his followers. His body was unceremoniously thrown into the Tiber. A decade later, his brother Gaius, who had pushed for an even more ambitious slate of reforms, would meet a similar fate, cornered by his political enemies and choosing suicide over capture. The unspoken rule, the foundational gentleman's agreement that had held the Republic together for 4 centuries, that political disputes were settled in the Forum with words, not on the hills with clubs and daggers, was broken forever. Violence was now a tool in the political kit. A terrible precedent had been set. The problem the Gracchi had tried to solve, the lack of land for the poor, did not go away. In fact, it created a new crisis. The Roman army had always been a militia of citizen farmers, men who owned property and thus had a stake in the republic they were defending. But as the number of small farmers dwindled, so too did the pool of eligible recruits. This became a critical weakness when, in the late 2nd century BC, vast hordes of Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and Teutons, threatened to invade Italy from the north. The Republic needed an army, and it needed a general. found him in Gaius Marius. Marius was a novice homo, a new man, an outsider from a provincial town who had risen through the ranks on sheer military talent, not aristocratic pedigree. He was blunt, ruthless, and brilliant. Facing the recruitment crisis, he made a revolutionary and fateful decision. He broke another of the Republic's fundamental rules. He opened the ranks of the legions to any citizen, regardless of whether they owned property. He recruited from the landless poor, the urban mob, the very men the Gracchi had tried to help. But he offered them a different kind of deal. The state could promise them little, so Marius made a personal promise. He told them, "Serve with me, fight for me, and I, Gaius Marius, will see to it that you receive a share of the spoils from our victory. And when you retire, I will secure a plot of land for you to farm." He created a new kind of army. For centuries, soldiers had sworn an oath to the Senate and the people of Rome. Marius's legionaries were still Roman soldiers, but their primary loyalty was not to an abstract state that had left them destitute. It was to the general who fed them, paid them, and promised them a future. The political equation had been irrevocably altered. The ambitious man now had a sword. And the man who would take that new, terrible weapon and turn it against Rome itself was one of Marius's own lieutenants, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was everything Marius was not. An impoverished aristocrat, decadent, urbane, and utterly merciless. Their rivalry, born of personal jealousy and political ambition, festered into a struggle for the soul of Rome. When the prestigious command of a war in the East was given to Marius by the assembly, Sulla, who had been given the same command by the Senate, did the one thing that was, until that moment, sacrilegious, unthinkable. He gathered the 6 legions he had waiting to depart from southern Italy, legions loyal to him personally, and he marched on Rome. The sanctity of the city, its sacred boundary known as the Pomerium, had been inviolate for centuries. No Roman general was permitted to cross it with his army. It was the ultimate taboo. Sulla shattered it. He fought his way through the streets, driving Marius and his supporters out of the city. For the first time, a Roman had used a Roman army to seize control of Rome itself to settle a political score. After fighting his war in the East, he returned to do it again, this time sparking a full-blown civil war. Victorious, Sulla had himself declared dictator, not for the traditional 6 months of an emergency, but for an indefinite term with the task of reconstituting the Republic. He then introduced a method of political control of horrifying new efficiency: the proscriptions. These were published lists of his political enemies. Any man on the list was condemned to death without trial, and any man could kill him and claim a reward. The state itself became an engine for personal vengeance and wholesale murder. Sulla, in an attempt to restore the old order of the Senate, had used methods so monstrous that they permanently poisoned the political culture. He eventually did what Cincinnatus and even Scipio had done. He voluntarily gave up his power and retired. But the damage was done. He had shown every ambitious man who followed him the ultimate path to power: win the loyalty of an army and march on Rome. The system was now a hollow shell. The old institutions, the Senate, the consulship, the assemblies, still existed. The rituals were still performed. But real power no longer resided in these offices. It resided in private armies, immense personal wealth, and the alliances between the great men who commanded them. The logical endpoint of this decay was the formation of the First Triumvirate. This was not a constitutional office. It was a private pact, a backroom deal between the 3 most powerful men in Rome to carve up the state for their own benefit. There was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, the Republic's most celebrated general. There was Marcus Licinius Crassus, its richest man, who had grown fabulously wealthy from Sulla's proscriptions. And there was a rising politician from an old but faded patrician family, a man of infinite charm, boundless ambition, and lethal genius: Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was the perfect predator, a man who had learned and synthesized all the lessons of the past century of political decay. From the Gracchi, he learned the power of the mob and how to use the tribunate to champion popular causes. From Marius, his uncle by marriage, he learned how to create a personal army, utterly devoted to his cause. From Sulla, he learned the utility of ruthlessness and the ultimate argument of force. And from Pompey, he learned the value of a brilliant military reputation. The triumvirate secured for him the command he craved: the governorship of Gaul. For nearly a decade, he remained there, systematically conquering the Gallic tribes. He fought a brilliant, brutal, and genocidal war, but its true purpose was political. He was forging an army of hardened veterans, an instrument of unbreakable loyalty and unparalleled fighting experience. At the same time, he sent back a steady stream of propaganda to Rome. His commentaries on the Gallic War, a masterfully written, third-person account of his exploits that cemented his image as a peerless military hero in the minds of the people. While his rivals bickered in Rome, Caesar was in the field, perfecting the formula for absolute power. The Senate and his now rival Pompey finally recognized the existential threat he posed. Crassus had been killed fighting in the east, dissolving the triumvirate and leaving Caesar and Pompey to face each other in a final contest for supremacy. The Senate issued an ultimatum. Caesar must disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen to stand for election. To do so, Caesar knew, would be to place himself at the mercy of his enemies, who would undoubtedly prosecute and destroy him. To refuse would be to declare war on the state. He brought his favorite legion, the 13th, to the banks of a small river that marked the border between his province and Italy proper, the Rubicon. To cross it with an army was an act of treason. He is said to have hesitated on the bank, weighing the fate of the world. Then, with the famous words, Alia iacta est, the die is cast, he gave the order to cross. That single act was the moment the Republic as a functioning ideal died. There was no going back. The long civil war that followed ended with Caesar's total victory. He pursued Pompey to Egypt and eventually returned to Rome as the undisputed master of the Roman world. He was made dictator first for 10 years and then for life. He was the king in all but name, careful to refuse the diadem when it was publicly offered, but holding more power than any of the Tarquins ever had. He began a massive program of reforms, settling his veterans on land, reorganizing the calendar, and extending citizenship. He was a brilliant administrator, but for a group of senators, his genius was irrelevant. He was a tyrant. They called themselves the Liberatores, the Liberators, and they believed they were the spiritual heirs of the first Brutus, the man who had driven out the kings. On the Ides of March in the year 44 BC, in a meeting hall at the foot of a statue of his great rival Pompey, a group of some 60 senators surrounded him. They drew daggers hidden in their togas and fell upon him. They stabbed Caesar 23 times to kill the king and save the Republic. But the Republic was already a corpse. In killing the one man who had brought order to the chaos, they had only created a power vacuum, unleashing 2 more men who were even more ruthless, and one who was infinitely more clever. The chaos that followed Caesar's assassination was immediate and bloody. The dream of the liberators, that the Republic would magically spring back to life once the tyrant was removed, died in the harsh reality of Roman politics. Power did not revert to the Senate. It fell to the men who commanded armies. The first was Caesar's most trusted general, Marcus Antonius or Mark Antony. The second, and most unexpected, was Caesar's grandnephew and adopted heir, a sickly but preternaturally shrewd teenager named Gaius Octavius, whom we call Octavian. These two, along with a lesser general named Lepidus, formed the second triumvirate. Unlike the first, this was not a private pact. It was a legally constituted 5-year dictatorship. Their first act was to unleash a new and even more terrifying round of proscriptions, a purge of their political enemies that made Sulla's look modest. The great orator Cicero, who had championed the cause of the Republic against Antony, was hunted down and killed, his head and hands displayed on the speaker's platform in the Forum. At the Battle of Philippi in Greece, the armies of Antony and Octavian crushed the last of the forces of the liberators. Brutus and Cassius, the leaders of the conspiracy, took their own lives. The dream of restoring the old republic was dead forever. What followed was not a war for ideals, but a raw, brutal gang war for the spoils of Caesar's legacy. Antony, the seasoned general, took control of the wealthy eastern provinces. Octavian, the political prodigy, consolidated his hold on Italy and the West. The final battle was inevitable, and it was framed by Octavian's brilliant propaganda as a clash of civilizations. In the East, Antony had allied himself with, and become the lover of, the last Ptolemaic queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. Octavian painted them as a decadent, Oriental-style monarchy, a threat to Roman tradition and virtue. He cast himself, in contrast, as the defender of Italy, the champion of Roman values. The struggle culminated in a massive naval battle off the coast of Greece at Actium. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant friend Marcus Agrippa, defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The lovers fled back to Egypt, where they eventually committed suicide, leaving Octavian as the sole, undisputed master of the entire Roman world. He was 32 years old. He held absolute power. The great question that hung over the shattered republic was, what would he do with it? Octavian had learned the fatal lesson from his great-uncle's mistake. Caesar had been killed not because he held absolute power, but because he had been too obvious about it. He had accepted the title of dictator for life, flaunted his authority, and allowed his cult of personality to grow unchecked. He had fatally underestimated the deep-seated Roman abhorrence for the title of Rex. Octavian understood that Rome would now accept a master, but it would never, ever accept a king. And so, in a series of carefully choreographed political maneuvers, he performed a masterpiece of political theater, the restoration of the Republic. In 27 BC, he went before the Senate and, in a grand gesture, publicly renounced all his extraordinary powers. He announced he was returning authority to the Senate and the people of Rome, restoring the Republic to its traditional form. The senators, many of whom owed their careers and their lives to him, and all of whom feared a return to civil war more than anything, predictably begged him to reconsider. They showered him with honors, giving him the new name Augustus, the revered one. They then proceeded to hand all of his powers back to him, but under new, constitutionally acceptable names. This was the genius of Augustus. He constructed an elaborate mask, a carefully crafted fiction that allowed him to rule as an absolute monarch while maintaining the outward appearance of a republican magistrate. He was not a dictator. He was the princeps, the first citizen, a title of respect with no legal authority. He was not a commander for life. The Senate granted him proconsular imperium, authority over the key provinces where the legions were stationed, for renewable 10-year terms. He did not rule by decree. He held the power of a tribune, which allowed him to veto the Senate and propose legislation. He did not give orders to the Senate. He merely gave his advice, which was, of course, always taken. He controlled the army, the treasury, and the political process, all while publicly proclaiming that he was nothing more than the first among equals, a servant of the restored republic. This grand deception, the Principate, became the foundation of the new Roman system. For the next 2 centuries, the emperor would rule as an autocrat while wearing the humble mask of a republican official. The reward for accepting this lie was peace. After a century of brutal, ruinous civil wars, the Roman world was exhausted. Augustus delivered what it craved above all else: stability. He ended the proscriptions, tamed the ambitions of the aristocracy, professionalized the army, and secured the frontiers. The period he ushered in became known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For 200 years, the Mediterranean world enjoyed a period of unprecedented tranquility and prosperity. The lie worked. With the endless political strife in Rome finally over, the provinces flourished. Trade expanded, cities grew, and Roman law and culture spread throughout the empire. The endless civil wars, which had bled the republic dry, were over. The memory of their horror was so great that the people were willing to trade the chaotic reality of republican liberty for the ordered security of one-man rule, as long as that man had the decency not to call himself a king. The history of the next century is the story of Augustus's successors and their relationship with the mask he had created. His stepson, Tiberius, a gloomy and capable administrator, wore the mask with sullen reluctance, uncomfortable with the hypocrisy of it all. His successor, the infamous Caligula, in a fit of madness and megalomania, tore the mask off completely, trampled on its pieces, and demanded to be worshipped as a living god. The Senate endured his insanity for 4 years before his own Praetorian Guard assassinated him. His uncle, the studious and unlikely Claudius, who was found hiding behind a curtain after the murder, was proclaimed emperor by the Guard. Claudius carefully and methodically pieced the mask back together, ruling as a conscientious, if often ridiculed, administrator. He was followed by the last of the Julio-Claudian line, the actor-emperor Nero. Nero didn't tear the mask off so much as use it as a prop in his own grotesque drama, a self-indulgent reign of artistic pretensions and murderous paranoia that ended with the armies in the provinces rising in revolt. Faced with certain execution, Nero committed suicide, lamenting, "What an artist dies in me!" The five good emperors Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, who ruled for the better part of the 2nd century AD, are considered good precisely because they wore the Augustan mask most perfectly. They were capable, conscientious rulers who governed in partnership with the Senate, treated the aristocracy with respect, and saw their immense power as a profound public trust. They ruled with wisdom and restraint, overseeing the Roman Empire at the absolute zenith of its power and prosperity. For nearly 200 years, the mask held. The carefully constructed lie of a restored republic, maintained by a succession of mostly competent men, had kept the peace and secured the empire. But the mask and the man behind it was held in place by the ultimate source of power Sulla and Caesar had first unlocked: the legions. For 2 centuries, the armies had largely remained loyal to the office of the emperor. But what would happen when the legions on the frontiers realized that the power did not reside in Rome, but with them? What would happen when they understood that they could not only defend the emperor, but choose him? The unraveling began with the son of the philosopher king, Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors, a man who had spent his reign fighting brutal wars on the frontier while writing Stoic philosophy in his tent at night, made one fatal, unphilosophical mistake. He chose his own dissolute son, Commodus, as his successor, breaking the tradition of adopting the most capable man for the job. Commodus had no interest in the mask of the princeps or the burdensome duties it represented. He saw the imperial power not as a sacred responsibility, but as a license for unlimited self-indulgence. He neglected the administration of the empire, leaving it to corrupt favorites, while he devoted himself to his own pleasure. His greatest ambition was to be a gladiator. He would enter the arena, his body oiled, to fight against terrified, poorly armed opponents or helpless animals, all to the adoring roars of the bought and paid for crowd. These antics were not just a sign of personal decadence. They were a public desecration of the imperial ideal. The emperor, the first citizen, the father of his country, was behaving like the lowest form of public entertainer. It was an embarrassment the ruling class could not long endure. He was eventually assassinated in his bath, strangled by a wrestler sent by his own courtiers. His death plunged the empire back into the one thing the Principate was supposed to have ended: civil war. The year of the 5 emperors that followed his murder saw the system collapse into its most cynical form. After a brief and bloody power struggle, the Praetorian Guard, the elite military unit stationed in Rome that served as the emperor's personal bodyguards, did something that would have been unimaginable to Augustus. They murdered the new emperor Pertinax, and then literally auctioned off the throne to the highest bidder from the ramparts of their camp. 2 wealthy senators competed, shouting out their offers, until one, Didius Julianus, won by promising an exorbitant donative to each soldier. The illusion of civic duty, of the emperor as the chosen servant of the state, was shattered. Power was now openly and nakedly a commodity, for sale to the man who could pay the most. This farce did not last long. The powerful legionary commanders on the frontiers, in Britain, in Syria, in the Balkans, were disgusted. They had the real swords, and they were not about to accept an emperor chosen by the pampered guards in the capital. A new and far more brutal civil war erupted. The man who emerged victorious was a ruthless general from the province of North Africa, Lucius Septimius Severus. He marched on Rome, dispensed with the auction winner Didius Julianus, disbanded the corrupt Praetorian Guard, and established a new dynasty based on pure, undisguised military might. He was a soldier, and he made no pretense of being a republican magistrate. The Senate was treated not as a partner, but as a subordinate body to be taxed and intimidated. His famous deathbed advice to his 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, became the unwritten constitution of this new era. Stick together, enrich the soldiers, and scorn everyone else. The mask of Augustus was gone, contemptuously discarded, and replaced with a soldier's helmet. The emperor was no longer the first citizen. He was the commander-in-chief, and the empire was his military garrison. What followed Severus's dynasty was the logical endpoint of his philosophy. The next 50 years, a period known as the crisis of the 3rd century, were a blur of violence, a complete breakdown of the imperial system. The throne became a revolving door of death. This period is best understood not as a list of names, but as a chaotic, bloody lottery. A general on the Rhine frontier would be proclaimed emperor by his troops after a victory. He would march on Rome, perhaps defeat the previous emperor in battle, and rule for a year or 2 until his own troops, bribed by a rival or simply greedy for another donative, would murder him in his tent and proclaim their own new candidate. The Roman Empire, in the half-century between 235 and 284 A.D., saw at least 26 different barracks emperors rise and fall, almost all of whom died violently. It was the ultimate and tragic conclusion of the Marian reforms from 3 centuries earlier. The army no longer served the state. The state was now merely the prize that the various competing armies bestowed upon their commanders. With no stable center, the body politic began to break apart. The constant civil wars meant the frontiers were neglected, allowing barbarian tribes to pour across the Rhine and Danube, and a resurgent Persian Empire to attack from the east. The empire was bleeding from 1,000 cuts, and the central government was too busy fighting itself to offer any protection. In response, the provinces began to take matters into their own hands. In the west, a general named Postumus established a Gallic empire, complete with its own emperor, senate, and consuls, ruling over Gaul, Britain, and Spain. In the east, the desert city of Palmyra, under its brilliant queen Zenobia, carved out its own empire from the Roman provinces of Syria, Egypt, and Anatolia. These were not rebellions against the idea of Rome. They were desperate attempts by local leaders to create a stable, functioning Rome in their own regions because the central government, the man in the city of Rome, had completely and utterly failed. The empire had fractured under the strain of its own internal contradictions. The empire was bleeding to death, a body with 26 different heads in 50 years, tearing itself apart. It was brutally stitched back together by a series of tough, no-nonsense soldier emperors, chief among them a man named Aurelian. In a whirlwind of campaigns, Aurelian defeated the breakaway empires of both Gaul and Palmyra, earning him the title Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. But his fixes, and those of his immediate successors, were temporary battlefield solutions. They had treated the symptoms, the invasions and the secessionist states, but the underlying disease remained. The system itself, the endless military lottery for the throne that rewarded ambition and treason, was still in place. To truly save the empire would require a man not just of military skill, but of brutal, organizing genius. A man who would see the fatal flaw in the system and rebuild it from the ground up. A man who would kill the ghost of the Republic and the fiction of the princeps once and for all. That man was Diocletian. He was of humble birth, a peasant from the Balkans who had risen through the army ranks on pure merit. He became emperor in 284 A.D. At the tail end of the crisis, and he saw the problem with absolute clarity. The problem was not the men. It was the office. The position of sole emperor was a single, glittering prize that invited endless competition. As long as there was only one throne, the generals of the empire would never stop fighting and murdering each other to sit on it. His solution was radical, a complete reimagining of the imperial office. He did not just take a co-emperor to share the burden. He created a system. It was called the Tetrarchy, the Rule of Four. It was a brilliant, almost mechanical attempt to solve a deeply human problem. Diocletian divided the empire into an eastern and a western half. He would rule the east as the senior emperor with the title of Augustus. He then appointed a trusted colleague, Maximian, as the Augustus of the west. Each Augustus then adopted a junior emperor, a Caesar, who would be his second in command and his designated heir. The idea was to create a stable, predictable line of succession. When a senior Augustus retired or died, his Caesar would be promoted to his place, and a new Caesar would be chosen. By dividing the prize, he hoped to diffuse ambition. By creating a clear path to power, he hoped to end the endless cycle of usurpation and civil war. It was a corporate solution to a political crisis, a board of directors for the Roman world. To reinforce this new system, Diocletian abandoned the last vestiges of Augustan fiction. The emperor was no longer the princeps, the first citizen. He was now the dominus, the lord and master. This new era is known as the Dominate. Diocletian introduced elaborate court ceremonies borrowed from the Persian monarchy. Anyone who approached the emperor had to perform proskynesis, prostrating themselves on the ground before him. He wore a diadem and robes embroidered with jewels. This was not mere vanity. It was calculated statecraft. He was deliberately elevating the office of emperor so far above the level of mortal men that it could no longer be easily seized by a common general on the frontier. The emperor was not just a commander. He was a semi-divine figure, God's chosen representative on earth. The Republic, with its pretense of shared governance and citizen magistrates, was now officially and finally buried. The emperor's word was law, his person sacred. The Tetrarchy, for all its cold, bureaucratic logic, ultimately failed. It failed because it could not contain the one thing it was designed to control, the singular, world-altering ambition of a truly great man. Diocletian and Maximian both voluntarily abdicated in 305 A.D. The only Roman emperors to ever do so, allowing their Caesars to rise as planned. But the system quickly fell apart in a new series of complex civil wars, as the sons of the original emperors, who had been excluded from the succession, made their own bids for power. The man who emerged from this crucible was the son of the Western Caesar, a general named Constantine. Over the next 2 decades, Constantine waged a series of brilliant military campaigns that systematically dismantled the tetrarchic system, defeating one rival emperor after another. At the Battle of the Milvian Bridge outside Rome, and later at the Battle of Chrysopolis, he defeated his final rivals and, by 324 A.D., became the sole master of the Roman world once more. The carefully constructed machine of 4 had been broken by the ambition of 1. Having restored sole rule, Constantine needed a new, more powerful ideology to justify it. The old pagan gods of Rome, whose authority had been shaken by the chaos of the 3rd century, were no longer sufficient. Constantine found his new ideological foundation in a religion that had been steadily growing throughout the empire, despite waves of brutal persecution, including a final, great persecution under Diocletian himself, Christianity. Before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine famously claimed to have had a vision of a Christian symbol in the sky, with the words, "In this sign, conquer." He had his soldiers paint the symbol on their shields, and he won the battle. From that point on, he became the patron of the Christian faith. By becoming God's chosen ruler on earth, he acquired a form of legitimacy that transcended military might or the approval of the long-dead Senate. It was a divine right to rule. He showered the church with wealth and privileges, presided over its councils, and began the long process of transforming the Roman Empire from a pagan state into a Christian one. The church, in turn, became a new, powerful pillar supporting the absolute, autocratic power of the man. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine were a monumental achievement. They had taken a shattered, dying empire and rebuilt it into a new, more rigid, and more resilient form. The new state, with its vast bureaucracy, its heavy taxation, its powerful and semi-divine emperor, and its new religious foundation, was a cage. It was a cage of bureaucratic and military control that saved the empire from immediate collapse and gave it another 2 centuries of life in the West, and another 1,000 in the East. But the cage, for all its strength, was built on a division. In creating the Tetrarchy, Diocletian had recognized that the empire was too vast to be ruled by one man from one city. He had created 2 administrative halves, an East and a West, each with its own capital, its own bureaucracy, and its own armies. Constantine had reunited them under his own rule, but he also cemented the division by founding a magnificent new capital in the East, on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium, which he named Constantinople, the city of Constantine. After his death, the empire was again divided between his sons. Though it would be briefly reunited one last time, the idea of 2 separate Roman worlds had taken root. The cage was strong, but in dividing it to control it, its architects had created 2 separate cages with 2 separate destinies. And as the storms of migration and invasion gathered on the frontiers, these 2 halves of the Roman soul would have to face them alone. After the death of Emperor Theodosius in 395 A.D., the split became permanent. He divided the empire between his 2 sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west, and the 2 halves would never again be truly united. The divergence between them, which had been growing for a century, now accelerated. The East was, and had always been, the wealthier and more populous half of the empire. It contained the ancient centers of civilization in Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt. Its economy was more robust, its cities larger, and its population more urbanized. It also had more defensible frontiers, with the deserts of Arabia and the mountains of Anatolia providing natural barriers. The West, by contrast, was more rural, its economy more fragile, and its finances strained. And it faced an immense, almost impossible strategic challenge: the long, porous frontiers of the Rhine and Danube rivers, across which vast confederations of Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Lombards, were being pushed by forces from further east, most notably the terrifying Huns. In the beleaguered West, the emperors themselves became increasingly irrelevant, shadowy figures hidden behind the high walls of their new capital, the swamp-defended city of Ravenna. Emperor Honorius, a man of spectacular incompetence, was famously more concerned with his pet chickens than with the news that the Goths had sacked the city of Rome. Real power was wielded not by these puppet emperors, but by a series of powerful, often barbarian, generals who held the title Magister Militum, or Master of the Soldiers. The Vandal general Stilicho fought brilliantly to defend Italy on behalf of Honorius, only to be executed by the paranoid emperor he was protecting. A generation later, the Roman general Aetius, known as the last of the Romans, forged an alliance of Romans and Visigoths to defeat Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, one of the last great victories of the Western Roman army. His reward was to be murdered by the Emperor Valentinian III's own hand. Power was now in the hands of these great military strongmen, but they lacked the legitimacy of the imperial title. The man who ruled the West was no longer the emperor in his palace, but the warlord at the head of his army. The collapse of central authority led inevitably to the collapse of the frontiers. On the last day of the year 406 A.D., a massive group of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed a frozen Rhine River and poured into Gaul, never to be expelled. The event that delivered the most devastating psychological blow, however, came in 410 AD, when the Visigothic king Alaric, after being repeatedly betrayed in negotiations with the imperial court, marched his army down the Italian peninsula and sacked the city of Rome itself. For 3 days, his men looted the ancient capital. It was the first time in 800 years that the city had fallen to a foreign enemy. Though the physical damage was not catastrophic, the symbolic damage was immense. Rome, the eternal city, the inviolable heart of the world, had been violated. Later, in 455, the city would be sacked again, this time far more brutally, by the Vandals who had sailed up from their new kingdom in North Africa. The idea of an eternal, invincible Rome was shattered forever. The new men who were taking over the western provinces, the Gothic kings in Spain and Gaul, the Vandal king in Africa, the Frankish king in northern Gaul, were not simply savage destroyers, as they are often portrayed. They were the new ambitious men, the new power players in a world where the old imperial structure was crumbling. In many ways, they were more effective leaders than the weak and isolated emperors they were supplanting. They were capable military commanders who could provide the security that the Roman state no longer could. Many of them did not seek to destroy Roman culture, but to emulate it. They adopted Roman law, issued coins in the emperor's image, and respected the Roman landowning aristocracy. They were, in effect, carving out new, smaller, more manageable kingdoms from the corpse of the Western Empire, becoming the new men who provided order in a chaotic world. The final act of the Western Roman Empire was not a great, tragic battle, but a quiet, pathetic farce. The year was 476 A.D. The last Western Roman emperor was a young boy, a teenager who bore the ironically grand name Romulus Augustulus, named after both the founder of the city and the founder of the empire. He was a powerless figurehead, placed on the throne by his father, the warlord Orestes. The real power in Italy was the army, which was by now composed almost entirely of Germanic mercenaries. Their commander, a Syrian general named Odoacer, demanded that his men be granted lands in Italy, a request Orestes refused. Odoacer's men proclaimed him king, and he marched on Ravenna. There was no great battle, no final stand. Orestes was captured and executed, and the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed and sent into a comfortable retirement. The system, the imperial administration in the West, simply stopped functioning. But Odoacer did not proclaim himself the new emperor. He did not take the purple robes for himself. Instead, in a gesture of profound historical significance, he gathered up the imperial regalia of the West, the diadem, the purple robes, the imperial standard, and he packed them up. He sent them in a delegation to the court of the Emperor Zeno in Constantinople. The message, conveyed by the Roman Senate, was clear. The West no longer needed its own emperor. One emperor, the one in the East, was sufficient for the whole world. The man in the West had failed. The office was now obsolete. The Western Roman Empire was over. But the idea of Rome was far from dead. In the West, the throne of Caesar was now empty, but the ghost of his republic and the memory of his empire haunted the halls of the new barbarian kings and the growing power of the Christian bishops. In the east, however, the throne was very much occupied, and the man who sat upon it, surrounded by all the ancient ceremony and majesty, still called himself, and was called by all his subjects, the Emperor of the Romans. In Constantinople, the dream of a united empire died hard. A half-century after the last emperor in the West was deposed, a man of extraordinary ambition and energy ascended to the throne in the East, Justinian. He was the last emperor to speak Latin as his first language, a man born a Balkan peasant who saw himself as the direct heir of Augustus and Constantine. He was the last man who would make a serious, concerted attempt to restore the physical body of the old empire. Driven by his vision of Renovatio Imperii, the renovation of the empire, he dispatched his brilliant general Belisarius on a series of breathtaking campaigns. In a whirlwind of victories, Belisarius reconquered North Africa from the Vandals and then, in a long and grinding war, retook the Italian peninsula from the Ostrogoths. For a brief, glittering moment, the Mediterranean was once again a Roman lake. It was a spectacular, heroic effort, a ghost dance of imperial restoration. But it was ultimately unsustainable. The reconquest was ruinously expensive, bleeding the eastern treasury dry. The long Gothic War left Italy devastated and depopulated, an easy prey for the next wave of invaders, the Lombards. Justinian's dream was a magnificent failure, an overreach that weakened the East in a futile attempt to reclaim a West that was already gone forever. Justinian's reign was a high watermark. Soon after, the strategic landscape changed permanently and irrevocably with the rise of a new, dynamic power from the Arabian desert, Islam. Fired by their new faith, Arab armies erupted out of the peninsula with astonishing speed and force. In the course of a single generation, they conquered the Persian Empire and stripped the Roman Empire of some of its oldest and wealthiest provinces, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. A century later, they would sweep across North Africa and into Spain. The loss of these territories forced the Eastern Roman Empire to fundamentally transform. It was no longer a Mediterranean-spanning universal state. It had to look inward, to its heartlands in Anatolia and the Balkans. It became smaller, more administratively compact, more militarily focused, more ethnically Greek in its language and culture, and more intensely, defensively Christian in its identity. The Roman Empire was now what modern historians call the Byzantine Empire, a state fighting not for universal dominion, but for its very survival. For the next several centuries, this transformed empire served as the bulwark of Christendom. A series of tough, capable warrior emperors, many from the so-called Macedonian dynasty, held the line. They were the new men of the East, autocrats who led their armies in person, defending the frontiers against a host of enemies. They fought the Arabs to a standstill in the East, pushed back the Bulgars in the Balkans, and dealt with Viking raiders on their northern borders. During this period, while much of Western Europe was fragmented and mired in what is often called the Dark Ages, Constantinople stood as the largest, wealthiest, and most sophisticated city in the Christian world. It was a beacon of civilization, preserving the philosophy, science, and literature of the ancient world in its libraries and monasteries, a treasure held in trust for a future renaissance. But the seeds of its own destruction were being sown, both from within and without. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, a Byzantine army was disastrously defeated by the Seljuk Turks. The battle itself was not a catastrophe, but its aftermath was. A subsequent civil war within the empire prevented a coordinated response, allowing the Turks to pour into the Anatolian heartland, the primary source of the empire's soldiers and food. It was a wound from which the empire would never fully recover. At the same time, a growing religious and cultural rift with the West culminated in the Great Schism of 1054, a formal split between the Catholic Church in Rome and the Orthodox Church in Constantinople. The two halves of Christendom now viewed each other not as brothers, but as rivals, and sometimes as heretics. And once again, the ambition of the man turned inward, as a series of debilitating dynastic struggles and civil wars in the late 12th century weakened the state at the worst possible moment. The ultimate betrayal, the mortal wound, came not from a traditional enemy, but from fellow Christians. In 1204, the leaders of the Fourth Crusade, an army of Western European knights and Venetian sailors, diverted their mission from the Holy Land. Driven by a toxic combination of greed, religious animosity, and Venetian commercial ambition, They turned their forces against the Christian city of Constantinople itself. After a short siege, they breached the walls and subjected the greatest city in Christendom to a horrific 3-day sack. They looted its churches, stole its holy relics, and burned its libraries. They then carved up the empire's territory amongst themselves, establishing a short-lived Latin empire on the ruins. Though the Byzantines would eventually recapture their capital some 50 years later, the restored empire was a pale shadow of its former self. It was now just a small, impoverished Greek state, surrounded by powerful and ambitious neighbors. The long twilight lasted for 2 more centuries. The restored Paleologan dynasty ruled over a state that was little more than the city of Constantinople and a few scattered territories. It survived through a masterful display of diplomacy, playing its larger enemies off against one another, but its decline was terminal. Its chief and final enemy were the Ottoman Turks, a new and powerful state that had risen from the ashes of the Seljuk Sultanate in Anatolia. Methodically, the Ottomans enveloped what remained of the Byzantine world, conquering the Balkans and crossing into Europe, until the city of Constantinople was an isolated Christian island in a sea of Ottoman territory. The final siege came in the spring of 1453. The young, brilliant, and utterly determined Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, brought an enormous army and a new superweapon, massive siege cannons, to bear against the ancient Theodosian walls. The last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, faced the overwhelming force with a tiny, vastly outnumbered garrison of Greeks and their Genoese allies. The city's fall was inevitable. For 53 days, they held out in a heroic, hopeless defense. On the final day, May 29th, as the Ottoman troops poured through a breach in the walls, Constantine XI, the last man to hold the title of Roman emperor, stripped off his imperial regalia and led a last, desperate charge into the fray. He died not as an emperor in his palace, but as a common soldier in the breach, fighting for the city that bore his name. The last Caesar fell. The city fell. The Roman Empire, after a continuous existence of nearly 2,200 years since its mythic founding, was finally at an end. Was this, at last, the end of the story? The story did not end. It merely transformed. The city had fallen, the last emperor was dead, but the idea of Rome was too powerful to die. Mehmed the Conqueror, upon entering the city, did not simply destroy it. He made it the capital of his own new empire. The Ottoman sultans, in one of their many titles, called themselves Kaiser I Rum, Caesar of Rome. In the distant north, the Grand Dukes of Moscow, who had inherited their Orthodox faith from Constantinople, married into the last emperor's family. They began to see themselves as the successors to the fallen empire, declaring Moscow the Third Rome. The idea of a universal, divinely sanctioned empire, the legacy of Caesar and Augustus, was a ghost that would continue to haunt the thrones of Europe for centuries. But the true, living legacy of Rome was not in the titles of kings or the ambitions of tsars. It was in the central conflict that had defined its entire existence, the struggle between the power of the one and the liberty of the many. The ghost of the Roman Republic, not the Roman Empire, haunted the minds of the Renaissance thinkers in Florence and the Enlightenment philosophers in France and Scotland. Machiavelli, studying the bloody history of the Republic, sought to understand the brutal realities of power. Montesquieu analyzed its constitution to understand the principles of liberty and the separation of powers. They looked back at Rome as a grand political laboratory, a 2,000-year experiment in the art of governance. The founders of the United States of America were utterly obsessed with it. When they sat down to create their new nation, the Roman Republic was the primary model and the primary warning. They saw in its history the blueprint for a large, durable republic, but also a cautionary tale of how such a republic could decay into tyranny. They built their constitution as a new Roman Republic, a complex machine filled with checks and balances designed to thwart the ambition of any one man. They created a Senate, gave the president a veto, established fixed term limits, and divided power between the federal government and the states, all in a direct, conscious effort to prevent the rise of a new Sulla, a new Caesar. The entire American political experiment, from the eagle on its great seal to the architecture of its capital, is a direct response to the long, glorious, and tragic story you have just heard. The echo of this ancient struggle is all around us, not just in America, but in any nation that calls itself a republic, in any society that grapples with the fundamental tension between leadership and law. It exists in the perpetual debate between the need for a strong, decisive leader in times of crisis, and the fear of concentrating too much power in the hands of one person. It is present in the friction between the demands of national security and the protection of individual liberty, between the will of a popular majority and the stability of its institutions. The war that Rome fought with itself, the war between the republic and the man, was never truly won or lost. It is a conflict inherent in the very nature of human society, a constant negotiation we are all a part of. As you drift now deeper towards sleep, let the grand sweep of this story provide a sense of deep perspective. The political passions that feel so urgent today, the crises that seem so unprecedented, are often echoes of this ancient Roman drama. The challenges we face are not new. The questions we ask about power, liberty, duty, and corruption are ancient. The story of Rome is, in the end, the story of us. A long, slow, and unending struggle to balance our deep-seated need for order with our profound and justified fear of power. And in that timeless struggle, in the recognition of that vast and repeating pattern of history, there is a deep and quiet peace.